one other thing we're kind of joining onto the next step from employees as being kind of central to that, and managing and owning, and where that responsibility lies. But also, organizations are not kind of silos anymore. I've seen the stat, it was kind of up to 80% of kind of internet traffic is actually API data. It is all systems talking to each other, and therefore integrated supply chains that are fundamentally changed. So organizations kind of, they also need to look outside of their own organization in terms of, it's interesting, not just how other supply chain, their own supply chain impacts them, but how they impact everybody else's. And that's another fundamental shift that organizations need to kind of take, because responsibility is no longer within their own four walls.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at some regulation like DORA, for example, that will specifically call out the need to be resilient, to understand your third-party supply chain and understand the risk that they may be exposed to, that they could expose you to in their operations. So regulation now specifically calls that out. And, you have to ensure that you're resilient, that your data remains confidential, that it has the integrity and availability. That's what we talk about, the CIA of data, right? Making sure that you're resilient, whatever the scenario is that you may be faced with, including if, some risk appears within your supply chain. You can't necessarily control that, but you can control how you respond to a threat that may emerge, and that's vitally important for organizations.
Yeah.
Just thinking how that almost takes us full circle right back to how we started the conversation. You're talking about your day in the life experience of those different devices, and you're talking about the integration of those different applications talking to each other.
Yeah.
Again, the focus of all of that is the data that's being generated, right? And the data that's being interacted with across those different applications. And it really hones back to that point of, you have to understand what your data is and where it is to know that you've got control of it when you're going to allow this integration to happen between those various different parts that make up your business.
Yeah. And is that going to increasingly change how organizations view their supply chain or how they're managing with their customers? Because it's not just down to price or commercials or ease of business. It's going to be down to integrity of things like kind of data security and resilience, because if your supplier goes down or suffers a data breach, that's a material impact on your business that can far exceed getting an extra 1% on a price because somebody else can do it a little bit cheaper. It's going to be such a fundamental part of how an organization effectively runs their own business.
Yes.
That needs to be a key part of how they choose who they deal with.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree. I think it's changed the conversations that are happening between parties that are thinking about doing business together beyond just the commercial arrangements, of course. But okay, let's talk about how secure you are. Do you present a risk to me? If I start to do business with you, if we start to integrate our systems together, what could that mean, right? Are you safe? Are you protected? Have you thought about this potential risk that you could inadvertently be introducing into my organization? So I think undoubtedly those conversations have to happen, are happening, because this is much more in people's awareness than it has been for many years, I think.
Yeah. And I think kind of just touching on, you kind of talked about kind of DORA as well, and actually sometimes language is important as well. We talk about kind of resilience, that move to can you kind of just automatically protect and defend? You work on the basis of we won't get breached, but actually resilience, and actually is having that wording in legislation helpful in terms of organizations not being kind of paranoid about, we have to absolutely ensure nothing ever goes wrong, because we have to understand things can go wrong, but actually having resilience and not just making sure that if things go wrong, that people can accept it and be open and transparent. And we were talking earlier about the need for transparency in the event of data breaches, for lots of different reasons, but actually getting organizations changing around backup, around business continuity, around changing the way they approach it to make sure that they do have resilience built in, and it's not all or nothing.
Yeah, I think the mindset has undoubtedly changed over all of the years that I've been in this industry, right? Many years ago, you might think, okay, maybe I won't be attacked. Now, the acceptance says you are going to be attacked, probably on a daily basis. Something's going to happen. Somebody's trying to get into your environment for whatever reason.
Yeah, not even deliberately. It might just be accidentally get into your system.
And I think that's where, as you say, the word resilience comes in, right? You acknowledge that you are going to be attacked in some way for whatever reason.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that? How do you keep your operations up and running? That is what resilience is all about, right? And if you look at it through the lens of critical national infrastructure, that has to keep running. No matter what happens, you've got to keep power to the homes. You've got to keep, this critical infrastructure running no matter what's happening. So the need to be resilient, this is what it's all about, right? How you withstand an attack, how you respond to that attack, and make sure that no matter what happens or is happening, you have a way to contain that, to respond to it effectively whilst keeping the rest of the environment up and running. And that is, it's a different mindset that regulation like DORA has really brought to the fore, and now it's kind of made it a mandatory element, if you will. But that's how all organisations should be thinking. Yeah.
And we've seen many occasions, right, where healthcare is an example, right? That innocent bystander of somebody else being targeted, they've been the recipient of, be it ransomware or whatever, that's crippled their environment because they don't have the requisite protections in place. So there have to be implications, I think, right? And DORA NIS2, I think, brings in those implications for organisations to make sure they are doing something and not just the back to the tick in the box type exercise that we were talking about before. If there aren't implications, then it's just implications by chance, right? It could cause an outage to us. It could cause an issue to our brand, etc. There needs to be something more broader that will make people stand up and think, okay, we actually have to take this seriously.
Yeah. But it can, from a digital supply chain perspective, that is going to make things more complicated, because there's one thing about kind of suppliers that you might have an API with and stuff like in data going backwards and forwards. You need to make sure that's secure, people running your systems, but also in terms of things like kind of other SaaS providers or cloud providers. You not just need to evaluate where they are in terms of resilience and the impact on your business, but also making sure that you have a more distributed system as well, to make sure that you don't have all your eggs in one basket. Does that mean organizations are now having to deliberately almost make their infrastructure more complicated because they need to distribute risk?
Yeah, well, I don't think they necessarily set out to make it complicated. Yeah. Maybe that's the end result, that it becomes more complicated, right? But we obviously will see people with information in multiple different cloud repositories, for example, and that's a way to potentially mitigate against risk. If one gets hit, then I'm safe because I've got some form of backup solution, some form of resilience in another cloud repository, for example. So I don't think there's anybody would set out to set up, as complicated an environment as possible, but that could be the byproduct of making sure that they're resilient, right? That could be the byproduct of thinking about how we mitigate the risk and spread our data maybe across multiple different places.
And I think that complexity and the need to, have maybe best of breed in certain technology areas, I can understand that where it makes sense, but also you can still understand that consolidation play where it makes sense, where you want something to be consistent across the entirety of your environment. Well, why would you look at doing, piecemeal solutions for that, right? You want to take a consolidated single approach that gives not only the same protection to the business, but the same user experience as well.
So you'll have a potentially more complex, if not deliberately, but more diverse infrastructure. But that's really important as well, especially when you have like multi-cloud or what have you. The importance of having these kind of more advanced solutions that have that intelligence built in terms of uniformity of things like policy and approach, because it's a combination of user experience, but also making sure that if you have policy and strategy, it's being deployed the same way across every single part of your infrastructure. Because where you have gaps, that's where you introduce your own vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I fully agree. And we talk about data security everywhere. And what that means really is that we understand from the very start, from the discovery all the way through to the point where we're monitoring and protecting that data across all of the different channels that it could be accessed upon. We have the ability to write a policy that can push across that whole environment to simplify the way that we protect the data, no matter where it is and what's happening with that data. And I think it's really important if we come back to data security posture management. I have had conversations where organizations may say, okay, great, I'm going to classify my data and then I'm done, right? Why do I need to buy this solution in an ongoing basis? Surely I'm classified and then I'm done. Well, this isn't a one and done conversation, right? We're generating terabytes, petabytes of data. I speak with very large public bodies and large corporates who are just generating incredible amounts of data on a daily basis. And so there is this need to continually make sure that in real time we can discover that data and make sure that we can react, respond, classify, prioritize in an ongoing basis, right? Because we just, as you said earlier in this conversation, Stuart, you'll never have less data than you've got today. It's just growing so fast, right? So DSPM is incredible, right? Data security posture management is a relatively new way to think about that discovery and classification of your data. It's evolving very rapidly, but it is something that I believe is going to be absolutely fundamental to any organization's ability to confidently say, yeah, you know what? I am secure, I have visibility, and I can take control of the data that's out there. And I can do that in an ongoing basis on a daily, weekly, minute basis.
Yeah.
I can make sure that we're always secure and we understand what's happening.
And having that dynamism is really important. I mean, if we had the kind of conversation just over 2 to 3 years ago in terms of what was everybody's strategy around making sure that they didn't have any potential data loss via AI models, I don't think that would have been high on everybody's list. Whereas
No.
I think it is now. You know, that's that fundamental change. So actually. And we don't know what's going to happen in the next kind of 1 to 2 years. Obviously, I'll ask you that at the end, and I'm sure you get the predictions all spot on. But that's the challenge. You don't know what's necessarily going to be coming very, kind of down the road. So having that approach where you can have that control, but that flexibility is absolutely fundamentally important.
Yeah, and I think to kind of reinforce that, so the pandemic we mentioned several times, right? Go back a few years, people knew about data classification. Of course they did.
Yeah.
But there was not such a demand and need for it because the number of cloud instances and repositories that people were using just weren't the same.
Yeah.
Right. And we've driven this uptake of cloud infrastructure and storing your data in lots of different places. And that's really driven that demand and that need for something more than what was just classification, which is where DSPM has obviously come from, to not just give you that ability to know what the data is, but understand where it is and understand the risk that poses to the organization. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and I suppose it's kind of interesting in terms of that kind of move towards kind of DSPM, and I want to kind of take that opportunity in terms of not necessarily just kind of what's coming next, but what are the kind of key criteria that organizations need to look at in terms of their technology, in terms of being able to not to try to predict necessarily what's coming next, but how to try to build in an element of resilience in their technology stack as well as resilience in their organization.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to, thinking about, okay, acknowledging first, I've got a challenge, right? I've got a problem. I've got data anywhere and everywhere. I don't understand who's doing what with it, how they're accessing it. Okay, that's the problem statement. What do I do about that? So when you're thinking about how you're going to solve that puzzle, I think it's important to, when you're looking at technology solutions, to select a solution that's going to enable you to get that broad coverage against all of the different places where you've got your data held, right? Against these multi-cloud environment. There's no good having a solution that's only going to cover one particular aspect of your data security journey. That's like locking a door and leaving the windows open, right? So making sure that you're choosing a solution thoughtfully that can take into account every possible use case, every possible place where your data may be held. That's easier said than done, right? No doubt, because there are so many places where your data could be held, deliberately or maybe not deliberately if people are uploading information to their own private, share sites and whatever it may be. But to think carefully about, the potential of where your data is to make sure the solution is able to, to take into account that, to look and discover data within those places. But then that's just the start of the journey, right? That is only part of this. So again, to the point of data security everywhere, we then need to think about the whole data lifecycle, the whole journey from discovery, classification, prioritization, and then we need to get into the kind of the monitor and protect mode as well. So ideally, if you could think about a platform that's able to offer that end-to-end cover across all of the channels that your data could be accessed upon, and then, moreover, a platform that's able to simplify the way that you apply policy across all of those different places where your data could be held, then you're going to have a very robust solution that's easy for you to operate, easy for you to run, but is going to give you that confidence that you've got that protection and that you're covered in every potential scenario. I think that's vital.
And making sure that your policies map to your business strategy as well, because we don't know what's going to happen from a data threat perspective in terms of the threat landscape, in terms of bad actors, what's going to happen. But organizations will hopefully have a plan for the next 1, 2, 5 years. Mapping your cybersecurity strategy against that is really, really important.
So our newly joined Chief Data Security Strategy Officer, so he has a quote that he's been using: if your data is not ready for AI, then you're not ready for AI. That's obviously a really topical viewpoint at the moment. But actually, if you take that back a step, right, if your data is not ready for whatever the next thing is that comes along, that puts you on the back foot. So the approach that we're talking about in terms of what you do with your data and understanding it, I think is applicable to whatever challenge comes next. If you get that footing in place, I think you're in a much better position.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of where we kind of potentially see that kind of the threat landscape evolving a little bit as well, in terms of, kind of there's a lot of talk at the moment. Obviously, there's been a bit of a rise in terms of more involvement in the conversation, at least in terms of state actors as well, because of the challenges around, obviously things like what's been going on with Russia and what have you. And there's been a lot of discussion about where things might be going in terms of kind of post-quantum, and then in terms of kind of data hoarding, if you like, from kind of potentially been talked about from kind of China, that what could happen after that sort of event. So there seems to be more involvement from much bigger entities from a state perspective, as well as the rise of all the other actors. But obviously AI has kind of then changed that as well a little bit, in terms of lowered the floor in terms of making it easier for everybody to get involved with. Kind of what are you seeing at the moment in terms of kind of maybe the trends from this year, and then potentially moving forward that organizations need to kind of maybe potentially be aware of and start thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, the trend for this year is 100% around AI, right?
Yeah.
And adoption of AI. Again, I mentioned those three kind of categories of AI, and I think that's what people are coming to terms with and getting their understanding of them. And I think there's been that rush to adopt some of these technologies, and then suddenly people have put the brakes on and are thinking, well, actually, what if? Right, what about this scenario and this scenario and this situation? And you've only got to look at some of the examples in the press. Manufacturing organisations who put intellectual property into open source models, right, AI models. Suddenly that information is available to the world at large. People who trained their customer-facing chatbots on internal data without sanctioning their data internally first, right? And suddenly you've got chatbots reciting poems about how bad it is to work in a particular organisation. So, crazy examples. Yeah. But that has been the absolute trend across this year, and that continues to be, arguably the most topical conversation that we're having with people right now. And I think that will continue across the next couple of years. Adoption of things like Copilot, Gemini. Obviously there are operational implications. There's cost implications for people to consider when they're looking at those technologies. I think those barriers will lessen over the next couple of years. And I think that will allow people to start adopting them, whether the organisation at large want to or not. Naturally, they're going to come in and be just much more prevalent. And I think that continued security focus on how they adopt those tools and how they move forwards with them, that's going to be what we see again over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think, linking to that is, the rise of the insider threat that we've already spoken about, right? We spoke earlier about the fact that it could be somebody innocently doing something that leads to an unintended consequence. Yep. And this is exactly where that's going to happen, right? As AI comes in, for people to understand, hey, you can't just put this company confidential information into these different models that you may be using. Do you understand, if you do that, this could be the consequence, right? So that need for education, I think, is vital, particularly this year as AI rises in popularity. People are going to be deploying it to drive that productivity. But, there's going to be that need to make sure people understand the impact of their actions, right? If they get something wrong, or if they start to share confidential information into them, right? So I think that's going to be a trend that we see and I hope that we do see it. I mean, we know we operate within a cyber skills kind of shortage at the moment. Yep. That's a real, and it's been an ongoing challenge for many years, right? But now more than ever, the need for education is there.
And not to get too deep into the other sides of AI, but then you start looking at the bias side of things as well. Yep. And the more people that adopt AI models internally within their organization, the more biased those closed models are to the feelings within that organization, the data contained within that organization. Now, in some scenarios, that's a really positive thing. So back to classification of data. Well, if you understand what's really important to an organization, you're going to get better classification of that data. But if you're using it to produce training material internally, for example, are you going to get a biased view, right, based on the people who've put the data together originally in that organization?
Yeah, I love that topic, right? AI has bias, right, depending who's trained those engines, right? It's a bit like newspapers will have a political leaning, right, depending which newspaper it is.
And reinforced by their readers, because then they want to sell to those readers.
Exactly.
And then it introduces an automatic loop.
And AI is exactly the same. And we've seen that recently, right, in the news with AI engines coming in from different nations, that have a political leaning. But I think maybe for some, you put a question into an AI engine and you believe the answer that comes back unequivocally because, hey, this is the response I got. It must be true. Right. So there's a need to have this kind of almost savvy, kind of worldly wise feeling when you're using these tools. Don't just blindly believe what you get back from them, because it could be a biased answer that's designed to manipulate you in some way, to the ends of, whoever it is that's made that bias in the first place. Right. And I think it's a really interesting concept. And I do fear, particularly for younger people growing up today, they lead their lives online. Yeah. And, they're using AI now far more in preference to the traditional browsers that you and I may have used in the past to search for information. and they're just going to blindly believe what information is presented to them on the screen, right? And I think it's a real, it's a concern.
It's a generational thing, absolutely.
No doubt.
And we're going to, and that's the people who are coming into the workplace now.
Correct.
And I think that's kind of easy to kind of forget and underestimate.
Yeah.
That in terms of that generation of those people coming in, then maybe they're going to be kind of starting in help desk and then IT ops, and then they're going to be working their own. They're going to be the next generation of kind of CIOs and system analysts.
Yeah.
But they're going to be brought up with this. But it's that kind of challenge you mentioned of organizations need to get that understanding. They need to make those sensible decisions. But the problem is there's the competitive situation that they don't want to put the brakes on this and go, right, we just need to take a step back at the moment, because their competitors are going hell for leather on it, and there'll be that FOMO.
Yep.
They'll be like, well, we can't just put a pause on this because AI is a competitive advantage potentially, or it could be a competitive disadvantage if we slow down. So organizations have to balance that need and potentially that board pressure of, you need to deploy this because everybody else is doing it and we don't want to miss out.
We had a prime example at a roundtable dinner. So we had a public entity and a private entity operating within the same space,
right.
And the difference was vast, right? The private entity had adopted AI into their kind of triage and help desk approach to dealing with their customers, and they had a multi-million-dollar saving figure that they could talk about. The public entity, in listening to that conversation going on, just had a view of, well, we could never do that. And I think, again, that contrast is really interesting to understand, because arguably it's a public entity who could really do with that, that saving, because of the benefit that would bring across the whole of, a country, for want of a better term, right, versus a private organization where it's purely about profit.
Yeah, I think it's always the case, right, when new technology emerges, you've got the early adopters, right, those guys that are happy to be the trailblazers and, really grab hold of something new and see how we can maximize the value that we get from it. And you have those others that say, well, actually, let me just wait and see. Let me wait until it's more widely adopted, and then I'll take action and think about whether to bring it in. I think the difference that we're experiencing now with AI is just the speed of the evolution of it, right? This is far, far faster than anything we've seen before within our world, within our cyber world, within our technology world, right? And this year, already this year, we've seen rapid evolution of AI technologies and its capabilities, and that's going to only accelerate, right? So even, people who might consider themselves to be laggards are kind of getting dragged into this world, sometimes kicking and screaming, but they need to do it. And, you come back to talking about the younger generation. You want to attract the very best talent into your organization to drive your business forward. Well, they're going to come in with an expectation that, hey, can I use these tools? How am I going to be productive? This is how we should be operating, right? So I think there is this drive, this momentum behind it that some people might be finding uncomfortable at the moment, but they needn't. There is a plan. There are tools out there that are able to help them to secure themselves. And it's a case of engaging in a conversation and saying, okay, this is the direction of travel. Help me. Help me go on this journey in a safe and effective way, not blindly jumping in with both feet, not advocating that at all.
No.
But let's have a plan, right? Let's think about how we can do this safely for you and take you forward.
It's that mindset of innovation, right, that they will come in. It's not coming in and sort of questioning, well, why can't I use this? It's coming in and being able to say, well, if I use this, this is what I can achieve, right? Versus a traditional way of approaching something.
And they own it in a different way. Because I think that, kind of, we can talk about AI and we can talk about machine learning and we can talk about all these things. All of that's been around for a long time. I mean, there's elements of machine learning all the way back to like the 1960s. So this is not a new invention in a way, but there's been, I suppose you could call it a democratization, that previously that was sitting in a big data center or, kind of data center the size of an office or a whole bunch of AS400s or whatever it happened to be. Whereas now it's in the hand of, teenagers using Snapchat and they've got the AI. Everybody, and I think that's the difference with this technology now, that they have that sense of ownership, and that's why they want to use it, and they can bring their ideas in, because previously AI and tech or whatever it happened to be, that was sitting in a big thing somewhere else, and then they just maybe engaged with it. Whereas now it's literally in the palm of their hand, and people own it in a different way, and that's right. That's the fundamental change.
I think they utilised the output from it before, right, and now they're in control of what's going in. To that AI tool as well, right? And they're in control, therefore, of what comes out the other side. But
it's so powerful, right? And it is, we're talking a lot about the risk of AI here, but the other side of that is the incredible benefit that it can bring. And historically, machine learning, it was learning from the past to give an output. Now it's predictive, right? It's learning from the past, but it's saying, okay, given what's happened before, this is likely what's going to happen in the future. That's an incredibly powerful business planning tool. if you're in retail, for example, you're looking at what's happening through various different seasons. You can plan, if you're in fashion, you can plan what kind of clothes you might be bringing to market because you understand what's sold in the past. Or if you're a financial services institution, you can understand when demand is going to ebb and flow. With AI, you can begin to predict these trends and structure your business accordingly. So it's an incredible, powerful tool. We are going to embrace it. We are embracing it. It's happening. But it's also, I think we are at a point in time where it's happening so quickly that there's a lot of risk out there as well, So yes, we have to think about the risk, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is an incredible moment in time that we're living through, that we're going to look back on and think, wow, I can't believe that.
And it's nice to be positive about it as well.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it links to, again, what we were talking about earlier, right? There still also has to be that business reason and business benefit for adoption of these tools.
Yeah.
So just because it's cool technology and it might streamline certain things, right? What is the business value really of bringing it in? Because it comes with a cost, right? Especially if you want to adopt an AI completely into your environment. So are you going to realize enough business benefit from adopting that technology?
Yeah.
And that's obviously the bit where we can't necessarily answer that question for people.
Yeah. No.
We can help with the outcomes in which it can help with, but the emphasis has got to be on them to also explore the benefit they'll get.
Yeah, I love that point of view. It's kind of, you must deploy this AI. Why?
Yeah.
What are you going to get out of it? What is the business value that we're going to get from it?
But we get it free with our Microsoft license.
Yeah.
That's why.
And it's cool. It's really cool. So that's probably not a strong enough reason, to do it. And I'm sure, there will be, but you're quite right, Stuart. I think it's a brilliant point as well, just to say, well, okay, maybe we don't need to move quite so fast. Let's be thoughtful about what it is that we're going to get out the other side of this, and make sure that we're taking time to do this in a secure and correct
and it's
way.
done in a positive way rather than a fear way.
Exactly.
Definitely. So I think we're coming a little bit kind of up to the top of the episode. So I think what's always nice to be able to do as well is I always want to have people to have practical takeaways as well. So in terms of listening to whether it's a customer or whether it's a kind of partner working with their customer, in terms of kind of over everything that we've just discussed around kind of AI and data security, there are kind of sensible things that kind of people can do. So, kind of just start with you, Stuart, in terms of what would you say that kind of people can start looking at in terms of just kind of practical, simple steps to be able to improve their data security posture, be able to look at their strategy and be able to kind of make a positive change in terms of, how they can get to a more secure posture.
Yeah, I mean, I look, doing some research, right, and you mentioned both in there customers and partners. I think those two working together, that's massively important. The partner landscape, that's where a lot of the expertise is. Yeah. But the partners can sometimes have maybe a slightly blinkered view on there, right? So they're answering the questions about adoption of things like Copilot, etc. We have a job to do to make sure we're educating those partners as well as the customers in terms of how you can securely move forwards with things like Copilot, as we've spoken about through pretty much all of this episode, right? That's where our focus is, making sure that people understand that, look, the huge benefits, there is risk, but there is a way to do this in a way that's going to benefit your business and reduce that risk.
Yeah.
And I think the takeaway for us is to make sure that we're getting around and delivering that message to people, making sure that people are educated in that way, because I think there's still a huge lack of understanding when it comes to putting these technologies in place, from the person who's like, we couldn't possibly do that, to the other one who's, why on earth haven't we done this already? And I think there's got to be that meeting point in the middle, and that's arguably where we can help people understand what they can do to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, fully agree with that. To get beyond the fear of the unknown, right? Take time to understand the situation and in exactly the way that Stuart describes. I think another really good step to take is to think about running something like a data risk assessment.
Yeah,
that's a starting point, right? I've spoken about the need to discover and classify your data, the need to get that visibility and control, which can be a very easy thing to say and a very daunting prospect when you don't really fully understand where all your data is today, how much you've got, how much is being created on a daily basis. Well, where do I start with that? Well, where you start with that, very simply, is a data risk assessment, which will give you a snapshot of what your environment looks like today and the potential risk that you could be exposed to. That's going to give you an indicator of, how big of a challenge do you have ahead of you.
Yep.
And by running a data risk assessment, either with your partner, with us, with yourselves, by pulling that together, we can then have a starting point for the conversation to say, okay, given what we've seen through that data risk assessment, we can now begin to pull a plan together. So we're not going to run about this blindly. We don't necessarily have to solve the whole puzzle within the next few days. We can say, okay, right, this is your path. Now let me understand more about what it is that you want to achieve as a business. And let me think about, okay, where's the logical place now to start with that data security journey? So I think that would be a very simple, logical place to start the conversation. And that is going to give us that foundational layer of data security, that ability to build everything else up above it, because fundamentally, you know what it is that you're trying to protect. And that has to be the starting point.
It's a really good point, right? The boil the ocean kind of analogy, right? That's where people fall down with this. They just think they've got too much to do. So that snapshot of one of your repositories, right? If you have data in that repository and you have issues in that repository, that's likely to be representative across every environment that you're operating within. So do that, initial look, get an understanding of where that particular area is at, and then build a plan. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Stuart. I had a conversation with a leading security manager within a very large public body, and the conversation could be summarized as, "Hey, Chris, I just don't know where to start.
Yeah,
I've got so much data, I don't know where to start." It's like, well, we can help you with that. Yeah. We know where to start, right? Let's start here with this data risk assessment and begin to break down the challenge, make it understandable first, and then we'll lay down a plan to get you to where ultimately you want to be, step by step.
Yeah,
right. And,
prioritization and mapping against business priorities as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I think is absolutely great place to start. Well, thank you very much for both of your time. That was a really, really interesting discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you.
Thank
you
very much. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks everybody else for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to subscribe to look out for the next one. Other than that, thank you very much.